Good afternoon. I'm not your normal lecturer in oh so many ways. Your normal lecturer, Ranji, is in fact my wife. She is at this moment lying at home complaining that she's got a cold, sitting in bed with the cat and waiting for me to come home and provide her with Lemsips. Sounds like you need a Lemsip too. But actually this is my annual treat. Once a year I get to give a talk to her students. We do it on various things. I am not an academic. I'm very different to everybody who will normally talk to you. Normally you are instructed, you're given ideas by people who are employed by the state, by university lecturers. Overwhelmingly, those people are Guardian reading lefties. You're going to get a bit of a shock with me today. My wife wants me to make it very clear that everything I say she disassociates herself from completely. She disagrees with me on almost everything politically and economically. I do not work for the government. I'd rather eat my own toes than work for the government. I risk my own capital to set up businesses, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. At the moment it's doing okay. And the main businesses that I run are financial websites. I write about companies. My main expertise is exposing stock market fraud. I also write about politics, and I should warn you, I am fairly right-wing. I supported Brexit, I supported Donald Trump, I voted Conservative, and do I need to go on? Having said that, my wife overlooks these minor blemishes. The talk today may horrify you. My aim is not particularly to horrify you, but to challenge you to think about things which you believe to be true, you believe to be facts, based on what you believe to be data. But in fact, I think you need to look at the data, you need to look at the real facts, and question some of your underlying assumptions. At the end of this, I'll take a few questions, or you can just throw your chairs at me and walk out. It's your call, but I'd like you to think about a few things. The talk is entitled Lies, Damned Lies, Public Sector Underpay and Other Myths. That's a misquote from the phrase lies, damned lies and statistics. I will be covering the myth that public sector workers are underpaid, the myth that nurses have had their pay cut, that it has not gone up over the past few years. We're going to cover a number of other myths as well and look at real underlying data. I'll start with a quote. This is in a book which my wife tells me is wonderful, therefore I assume that it's complete and utter rubbish. But the quote is absolutely accurate. Once a number appears in one news report, that report becomes a potential source for everyone who becomes interested in the social problem. The number takes on a life of its own and it goes through number laundering. Its origins as someone's best guess are now forgotten, and through repetition it comes to be treated as a straightforward fact, accurate and authoritative. It's not just quotes where this happens, it's opinions. I was writing an article today about this lady. Do you all know who she is? Does anyone know who this is? I realised that in her pomp, when she was Britain's greatest ever Prime Minister, you guys weren't born. This is Margaret Thatcher. She was the first female Prime Minister this country had. She was Prime Minister for 11 years. From 1979 to 1990, and she was mentioned on the radio yesterday, by the BBC's environment correspondent. And the BBC's environment correspondent, who believes in the bogus religion which is global warming, was making a statement that Margaret Thatcher smashed the miners. Margaret Thatcher, the reason we don't have we're not going to have any coal-fired power stations in this country in 2025 is because Margaret Thatcher smashed the miners, so destroying our coal industry. And I'm sure if I went to speak to people who were maybe 15, 20 years older than you, they would agree with that. Margaret Thatcher waged a vicious war on the miners north of England. The police showed utter brutality, and her aim was to close down the British mining industry. That is the popular view of Mrs. Thatcher. In fact, it's completely untrue. Between 1979 and 1984, the leaders of the National Union of Mine Workers tried to get their workers out on strike on 9 separate occasions, and the workers refused. Finally, in 1984, they managed to get 2/3 of the workers walking out. In 1984, Britain produced around about 105 million tonnes of coal a year. It produced it from 180 different pits. The most cost-effective was producing coal at £24 a tonne. The least efficient was producing coal at £120 a tonne. Those were the old pits in Kent, where the coal had almost gone. They were totally uneconomic. They were losing money, and the grateful taxpayer was having to pick up the tab. Most pits in Britain were losing money. At the end of the miners' strike, which incidentally 1/3 of miners refused to take part in, from day one, they saw that their leaders were wrong and that Mrs. Thatcher was right. At the end of the miners' strike, Mrs. Thatcher allowed a rationalisation of Britain's coal industry. In 1988, that rationalisation was complete. She had got rid of 2/3 of the people involved in mining. The workforce had fallen by 2/3. You know what had happened to output? Britain was still producing 100 million tonnes of coal. It's just that the coal industry was profitable and not a drain on the taxpayer. There was more money available for health, education and good things rather than subsidising a loss-making industry. There is therefore no way on earth that Mrs. Thatcher smashed the miners and destroyed the British coal industry. That is a myth. But if you go and ask people out there, they would believe it is a fact, because it's been repeated so often and because people don't dare to challenge it. In circles like this, it's not terribly fashionable to be a Tory. In places like universities, you don't dare admit, as I did, that I went to line the streets for Margaret Thatcher's funeral. It's not a fashionable cause, but actually it's true. But it makes the point that if you repeat an untruth often enough, people will come to believe it. I'm lucky in that before preparing this talk, I actually have the slides from the same talk, which was given 2 years ago by a person who at that point worked at this university. I'm going to include a number of his slides. I'm going to skip through them just to show that the guy was talking complete and utter bollocks and was misusing data. We started with his assertion that women get paid less than men, that women suffer badly in the workplace, which one would interpret to believe that there is some inherent sexism, some discrimination against women. And I can see by some of the angry faces here that a lot of you believe that to be the case. Fortunately, when you go into the workplace, you will find that is simply not true. Nonetheless, if one looks at the slides from a couple of years ago, and no doubt every other year that this course has been taught, you will see clear evidence of discrimination against women. They do less well in the workplace. This is one showing that the top earners, the high earners in Britain today, are essentially all men. This is one showing the gap between men and women in terms of average pay. It depends how you define average pay, and we'll come to that in a while. But this is in 2013, and there is an assertion that women earned less, 16.4% less on average than men in Britain. Well, we see that Britain's doing a little bit better than some other countries. In Estonia, the purported gap is 29%. In Germany, it's 21.6%. But this chart tells you that there is a very big gap between the average pay of men and the average pay of women. It's not true, but the chart looks convincing. And this chart, this graph here, suggests that we have had legislation which has improved the situation, and the situation has got better, but that women are still doing less well than men. The message from the bloke who gave this lecture 2 years ago and taught complete and utter bollocks was that if you are a woman, you're effectively working for free from the 11th of November to the 31st of December. That is the message that you will always get when you discuss this subject. And the reason is that there are people who are lobbying for more legislation. There are people who are lobbying for higher pay for women. It won't be all women that benefit. This just shows that the situation has got better over time, but it's still terribly bad. Now, here's the truth. This is from a report that came out very handily for me 2 days ago by a body called the IEA. The report was written, as it happens, by a woman, Kate Andrews. The two takeaways from here are, the first one, the official gender pay gap is 9.1%. Well, hang on a second, I thought it was 16%. Well, Kate explains that. Calculations that put the pay gap above 9.1% are achieved by moving away from like-for-like comparisons between men and women. The Equal Pay Day campaign, that would be of people lobbying for higher pay for women, calculates a 5 percentage points higher, or 55% higher than the official figures, by using the mean rather than the median of the ONS data. You understand the difference between mean and median averages. Mean is you have 10 numbers, you add them all up and you divide by 10. Median is you put them all in a row and you get the middle one. The problem with a mean is it can be skewed by what's called outlying data. There are, for instance, how many people who are in the squads of Premier League football clubs? 20 times 20, 400. And they are all earning sky-high salaries, and they are all men. Wayne Rooney skews the mean data, as do all the other people playing professional football and most other professional sports. And there are far more outlying men than there are women. And that explains part of the difference. So we've already established that the bloke talking bollocks 2 years ago was wrong with his 16% figure. The real number's about 9.1%. But the key takeaway from Kate's report, and the one that concerns you as you go into the workplace, is that for men and women between 22 and 39, the pay gap is actually negligible. And there are various reasons for that. The gap widens for older workers. There are 3 reasons for that. The first is childbirth. Women have children, men, maybe with medical technology, but generally men don't have kids. There is more of a tendency for women to take a career break to look after their kids than men. In our highly progressive relationship, my wife is working full-time, I am taking time off. I'm lucky I can afford to. And so that is very unusual though. In most cases, it is the woman who takes the career break. If you take a career break of 3 or 4 years until your kid's in primary school, that's great for you, it's great for the kid, but it does mean that you have 3 or 4 years of annual pay rises and promotions which you miss out on. And when you go back into the workplace, you have missed out on those 3, 4, 5 years of pay rises and promotions, whereas the men haven't. So it is just a fact of life. There is no point trying to put legislation in for it. It is just a fact. More women take a career break. Get over it. The next reason why the gap widens for later in life is simply a function of demographics. When I started in the workplace, we can take the example of law firms. Something like a quarter of graduate intakes at law firms were women. 3/4 were men. Today, the number of graduate intakes at law firms who are women in the city has topped 50%. Last I looked, it was 52%. That has clear implications as you go on in life, because today's graduates will be the people who become partners in 20 years' time. So when I started in the city 30 years ago, the chances of, there were far fewer women starting in the city, or law, or accountancy, who would go on to become partners than there are now. Demographics will simply wash through. There will be more women, or older women, achieving senior positions across industry and across the city and across many professions, because there were more who started. So that is another reason why the gap is negligible for younger workers, but for older workers right now, there is a gap. But that gap will simply close because of time. I think there is a final reason, which is that, again, it's another factor of demographics. There is a lot of talk in my world, in the corporate world these days, of how you need to have quotas of women on boards of companies. And these are going to be the highest paid workers, people on boards of quoted companies. So having more women would help this gap amongst the gap between men and women, particularly as people who tend to sit on company boards tend to be older workers. But it's just simply there were far fewer people who entered industry, certain professions like industry, law, accounting, finance, 30 years ago than there are today. So these things will all change, but the key takeaway is that whereas 30 years ago there might have been a pay gap in the 22 to 39, today there is no gap at all. The data, which you were told 2 years ago, was grossly misleading. But it's something which is accepted. And people say we've got to do more to squeeze the pay gap. Well, there is no pay gap. It's great news for you, because when you get a job in 3 years' time, the chances are that whether you're male or female, you're going to get the same wage. One thing I would just say is be careful what you wish for. If you look at this is a graph showing the difference between male and female life expectancy since 1850. There has always been a thing that women live longer than men. Throughout the whole period, whether we're at war or peace, women live a couple of years longer than men. Back in the 1850s, when life expectancy was in the mid-40s, women would live 2 years longer than men. The peak gap for women is in the early 70s. Childbirth improved, fewer people die in childbirth, general health is improving, and women get to live 6 years longer than men. Since then, we've had many more women going into the workplace. In other words, the lifestyle patterns of women are coming closer to men. More women work, they have the unhealthy thing of business lunches and putting on weight, going for a drink after work. They are taking on the patterns of men increasingly. And as a result, women, the gap of life expectancy is narrowing. So one of the benefits of moving to equal pay is that women get to die a bit quicker. Now, one of the other things of this presentation from 2 years ago was a focus on absolute wealth. In this slide, which my wife has actually doctored, there were three people. Wayne Rooney, the footballer, who in 2015 was earning 13 million quid a year. Footballers are a little bit misleading, because you only have your career for 15 years, maybe shorter if injury gets in the way, and then your earning power goes down dramatically. But there's no doubt that Mr. Rooney is quite wealthy, although I see his antics in the newspaper, he might be about to give a large portion of his wealth away. But he does jolly well. Theresa May earns quite a lot of money. The third slide here, which used to be there, was the Vice-Chancellor of Bath Spa University, who earned, before she left, a lot more than the Prime Minister. Why do I mention this? Because this, I think, shows the way that the debate on wealth is coloured. We can all agree that Theresa May is a useless Prime Minister. The Vice-Chancellor of Bath Spa University, good riddance to her. She was clearly overpaid, and no one likes the Vice-Chancellor of University. And Wayne Rooney, well, he's a pretty loathsome individual too. It's very easy to feel antagonism to footballers. Therefore, this slide is telling you that you frame the debate, rich people are bad. I'd like you to consider a couple of other people. Oh, here she is, your former Vice-Chancellor. Here she is. I'd like you to consider a couple of other people. These are people who are genuinely wealthy. Sir Alan Sugar is worth 1.15 billion, or he was in 2015. He's the 95th richest person in Britain. Alan Sugar started with absolutely nothing. He did not go to a posh school. He didn't go to university at all. He started selling stuff in market stands in Hackney. He is a very, very good businessman. Of that 1.15 billion, he's made bugger all from appearing on television hosting The Apprentice. He has made it through business. He set up a company, Amstrad, Alan Michael Sugar Trading, and he made money. He set up numerous other enterprises. He has risked his capital. He's done it through hard work. In doing so, in setting up all these businesses, he has created tens of thousands of jobs. And those businesses have made vast amounts of profits. That tax which those companies are paid, and which Alan Sugar has paid, has funded vast amounts of public works. It is on those tax revenues which the government is reliant to fund schools, education, health, defence, everything else. Alan Sugar is who I'd like you to think about in the rich. Vin Murray is a friend of mine. Vin Murray's parents arrived in this country with absolutely nothing in the 1970s. Vin's first experience was when her dad, who'd set up a corner store in Coventry, had the bank come in to try and seize it from him. The bank were behaving like sods. Vin, aged 15, managed to persuade them to go away. Vin is now a couple of years older than me. She has set up numerous businesses. The most recent one was sold for hundreds of millions of pounds, and that's made Vin, I don't know whether she's worth 100 million or 200 million, but when you start being the daughter of a guy who's about to have his corner store seized, she's done pretty well. In setting up those businesses, she has created thousands of jobs. The most recent one was providing IT systems to make the health service more efficient, to improve healthcare delivery for all, which I think is probably a good thing. But it was hugely profitable. So she's improved the health service, generated millions of pounds in taxation for the government to spend on good causes, and she's created thousands of jobs. The fact that she is rich, well, she's done her bit, I think. If you didn't have the prospect of being rich, no one would ever start up a business. But that's who you should be thinking about when you think about rich people. People like Sugar or Vin Murray are worth far more than Wayne Rooney or the Prime Minister or your former Vice-Chancellor. They are worth real money. That is how you should think about who is rich. And I'd like you to frame the debate in those terms. We then had a whole load of slides from the bloke talking bollocks 2 years ago on wealth and income distribution. Wealth and income are two different concepts. Wealth is the amount that you're worth. How much you've got in your bank, any shares you own. In most people's cases, it's the value of their home, their property. That is your wealth. Income is how much you earn each year. But there was a whole load of slides about wealth distribution and income distribution. And you'll never guess what? The gap between the rich and the poor. The wealthiest, those with the biggest incomes, the least wealthy, those with the lowest incomes, has increased in recent years, and that is deemed to be a terribly bad thing. I'll tell you what, it's actually been increasing for 200 years. The big increase in the gap between the rich and the poor happened in the 1800s with the Industrial Revolution. Before then, most people in this country just sat in the countryside working on farms, and there were a few people in the aristocracy who did whatever they did. And then a new breed of people came forward, capitalists. They became incredibly wealthy, running factories. The gap between rich and poor widened in Victorian times far more than it has in recent years, but it has been constantly increasing. Again, the distribution of wealth, this will tell you that the richest have got a lot more and the poor are very poor. Whatever. And again, the gap between the rich and the poor is increasing. Oh, this is dreadful, this is dreadful. And so it goes on and on and on and on. The poorest 80% of the population have seen their share of incomes fall since 1979. What happened in 1979? Oh, it's that bitch Thatcher. She got elected. Well, let's forget about the fact that in 1976 this country was so bankrupt we had to get a bailout from the IMF. The bad things all started with Mrs. Thatcher in 1979. And here we're told that since 1979, the poorest 80% have seen their share of incomes fall. Okay, I take all of that on read. Now, have a look at life expectancy again. Life expectancy is kind of important. Life expectancy at birth in England and Wales, 1841 to 2011. And you'll see that despite this increase in the gap between the rich and the poor, both in terms of wealth and income, life expectancy has gone through the roof. So you could have been more equal back in 1840, whether you were a poor person tending your fields or a rich person doing whatever rich people did in 1840, you'd have been more equal, you'd have been happy. Yeah?
That's only because we've got like an NHS. What about the USA or something? If you get cancer over there, you can't afford the drugs, then you die. So
okay, well, I'll take you on 2 points. This is the last interruption I'll take. I'll take questions at the end. The NHS came in 1945 when life expectancy is already 73. So you're wrong on that point. Secondly, you can talk about the US and the UK. As Sarah Palin quite rightly pointed out, in the UK, it's not a matter of whether you can afford healthcare, it's whether the death panel will treat you. When you offer a service for free, as we do for healthcare in this country, you will by definition have unlimited demand. You can check how many calls were made to 999 last year with people asking for aspirin. The reason they did that is because it is free. When you have unlimited demand and by definition limited supply, you can't spend everything on the NHS because there is no money tree out there. When you have unlimited demand and limited supply, you also have an ageing population. Eventually, you have to have what's called a death panel. That means the doctors say, yeah, my dad's got cancer, he's 80, your dad's got cancer, he's 75. I'll tell you what, my dad can die, your dad can live. That's a death panel. And that's what you get when you have unlimited free healthcare. But we distract because the main point is the NHS only comes in 1945. You have a massive rise in life expectancy before the introduction of the NHS and after the introduction of the NHS, despite the fact that people are more and more unequal. So it's very easy for someone who is a university lecturer on 40 or 50 or 60 grand a year to lecture you about the evils of income inequality. Because for them, it's all about some concept of relative equality. For you, if you're poor, it's about absolute things. In 1900s London, you would find that in the poorer districts, a good percentage of kids didn't have any shoes. Their families could not afford shoes. Their families couldn't afford new clothes. They would have hand-me-downs. And that is how they existed. It didn't matter if there was snow on the ground. There were kids running around London and Liverpool and other big cities with no shoes. That's because they were poor. By the 1930s, nearly everybody's got shoes, but still there is quite a lot of people in the urban poor who have hand-me-downs as their clothes. If we then come to the 2000s or the 2011s, even those who are poor will all be able to put sneakers on their kids' feet. The average, amongst the urban poor, the average kid owns more than one pair of shoes. They will not have hand-me-down clothes, they will have new clothes. In absolute terms, they are better off. And that is the key thing. It's all very well for us who are relatively affluent to talk about relative poverty and to talk about Wayne Rooney and the iniquity of his pay. The key thing is absolute poverty, eradicating absolute poverty. Incidentally, we see that in the third world. No doubt you'll be discussing that various other parts in the lecture. Oh, the horror of getting people to go in India and earn £2 a day or 2p a day or whatever it is, making Nike shoes in sweatshops. Well, sure, it may seem awful to you, but actually, before they went to work in the Nike sweatshops, they were out there in the rice fields. They were earning only a fraction of that. They were getting bitten by snakes. Life expectancy was much, much, much lower. So, in a way, you'll be told this is wicked Nike and us in the West exploiting the third world. But actually, we're helping these people to live longer and to be better off, to be richer. Is exactly the same process as happened in the Industrial Revolution in this country. When people moved from the fields of an agrarian society in the 1700s to what you might quite rightly say were the slums of the industrial towns and of London in the 1800s, actually they all lived longer. They were better off. There was far less starvation. They had food in their bellies. They got better. Now, this is a nurse. I want to go here on the real manipulation of data. During the last election campaign, there was a famous thing when a nurse confronted the Prime Minister and claimed that her pay had been cut by 14% by the wicked Tories. 14% in real terms. Now, the nurse made that claim, the Labour Party picked up on it, and very soon it was a claim which was being repeated without question by the media and by politicians. It was just taken as a fact. Fact, by the way, is derived from a Latin word. It is something that has happened. The only problem, of course, is that nurses' pay had not been cut by 14%. That was a myth. The 14% number comes from looking at the pay of nurses with their headline increase. Due to what was laughably called austerity, nurses got pay increases of 0% or in most years 1% after the coalition took power in 2010. And so you take that headline number and you then compare it to overall inflation and say that in real terms your nurses are 14% worse off. Actually, I think the nurse who confronted Theresa May talked about a 14% reduction in take-home pay, which is even more misleading. Because the actual data is very different. Sure, there was a headline capped increase for all public sector workers at 1% in most years, 0% in most other years. However, within most parts of the public sector, including university lecturers, don't tell my wife I said that, but also the NHS, there are grade increases. You simply get promoted to another grade by being there a year for 1 year more. Last year, 54% of workers in the NHS got a grade increase. So it's all very well saying that take-home pay went up by, fell in real terms by 14%, but that's not actually what happened to most people in the health service. It's not what happened to most nurses. Not only did they get their 1% increase, but they got their promotions, which could often result in pay increases of several £1,000s. As an added benefit, the wicked Tories also increased the threshold at which you paid tax. This was something which was disproportionate benefit to lower paid workers, increasing the threshold at which you pay tax from £10,000 to £12,000. If the marginal tax rate is 20%, you're suddenly 400 quid better off. That affects your take-home pay. None of that was reflected in the statement. But still, this nurse telling Theresa May that nurses' pay take-home pay had gone down by 14% was taken as a fact. It was not. It was nothing other than a lie. Nurses' take-home pay went up. It went up by a lot more than 1% a year on average, and the take-home pay was boosted further by the changes in the tax system. There is a wider debate now, and it's moved on from just the nurses to the whole public sector. We are told that the wicked Tories are releasing the restrictions on public sector pay, and they're doing so in response to demands from the population, because we recognise that the Tories have punished the public sector, and public sector people don't earn as much as the private sector. We wicked capitalists. And that's taken as read. I'm sure if I'd asked you before, do you think people in the public sector earn less or more than wicked capitalists, you would all overwhelmingly have said yes. Most opinion polls show that, in fact, the vast majority of the population believe that to be fact. And that is now influencing public policy. Personally, I think that's a mistake. This country runs a large budget deficit of 50 billion. We owe more as a country than any other country in Western Europe. 1.6 trillion. This company is hurtling towards a stage of financial insolvency. Thankfully, it's not my problem. I'm going to be retiring in a few years, so I don't care. But it's your problem, because throughout your working life, you're going to have to be the taxpayers servicing that debt, and eventually having to start thinking about paying it off. Already today, we spend more servicing our national debt than we do on, for instance, defence. We spend 45 billion a year on that. So I don't think the government's got a lot of room to go on spending more money. But that's not what everyone else thinks, because they know that public sector workers get paid less than those in the private sector. And also that we private sector workers have had big pay increases and public sector workers haven't. Well, actually, that's not actually the case. If you go to the Office of National Statistics, you will see that in 2013, the average public sector employee was earning $26,933. That was well above the national average. So in 2013, they were earning more than people in the private sector. By 2016, the ONS shows that number, public sector pay, had increased to $27,974. That is, again, more than people in the private sector. It depends, of course, whether you take mean or median. I'm waiting for that. So let's use median, which is more reflective. Those were the mean numbers. The average median gross annual pay was £25,002 in 2016 in the public sector. In the private sector, it was £22,500. Public sector workers earned, on average, 11% more. Hourly median gross pay in 2016 was £14.77 in the public sector. It was £11.10 in the private sector. That is 32.6% higher. The average increase in public sector pay, and again I'm using median just to stop anyone asking another question, the average pay increase since 2009, since the advent of the wicked Tories and coalition, was 1.56% for the public sector. For the private sector, it was only 1%. That's because during the economic downturn of 2009, 10, 2008, private sector wages absolutely tanked. Public sector wages are not affected by economic downturn. We folks in the private sector are, and our wages tanked. So public sector workers earn more than we in the private sector, whether you look at mean or median, and they've had bigger pay increases. We could go on. Full-time public sector employees work an average of 35 hours a week. We wicked capitalists in the private sector work an average of 37.5 hours a week. The sickness rate in the public sector is 2.9% compared to 1.7% in the private sector. The strike rate in the public sector is 15.1 days a year. That's on average, 15.1 days. That's an extra 3 weeks annual holiday. In the private sector, it's just 0.8 days. So, actually, they get more holiday as it is as well. They get better pensions. Those are the facts. But before I told you this, had anyone bothered pointing this out? That is not how the debate is defined. that really is it from me. In fact, it is it from me. I hope I've made you think about statistics, looking at critically who is giving you the data, because often the people giving you the data have their own agenda, whether it's lobbying for better pay, better conditions for their special interest group, and you can see how data can be distorted. Thank you very much for your time. Does anyone have any questions? No? Okay. Have a good day.